Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Church at RB Online. Thank you so much for choosing to spend this time with us. It's going to be a great service. It's officially summer this week, and we're in our summer teaching series, Raise Your Voice. Pastor Jared's being joined by pastors and speakers from around the country this summer, and today we're going to hear from Pastor Jay Kim of Westgate Church. We can't wait to hear what Jay has to say, but before we do, let's worship together. See you in a bit.
Darkness run for cover. Oh.
Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for Church Online. We've been having a great time so far hearing from Pastor Jared and Sam Acho in our summer series, Raise Your Voice. And we know you're going to love the guests we have for you today. In just a few minutes, we'll go live to the worship center for a great message from Pastor Jay Kim. We had an amazing time with all of you this past weekend at Good Neighbor Day. You showed up and gave meaning to what we call being good neighbors to the community. We had some new projects this time around, and my favorite was the library move-in for Pacific Theological Seminary, a new seminary here in San Diego led by our very own good book teacher, Dr. Mark Strauss. Thank you so much to everyone who came out and showed the tangible love of Jesus to our city yesterday. Coming up this Tuesday, June 29th, is our next youth night. All youth grades 3rd through 12th are invited to enjoy a night of fun, worship, small groups, and of course, pizza. Youth night happens every Tuesday from 6:30 to 8, and here's the sweet part: free dinners provided with no registration required. I'll be there, and I can't wait to help your kids grow in their faith and make some solid friendships. Lastly, we have the next session of Preparing for Retirement coming up on July 26th. Whether you're retired, planning your legacy years, or maybe you've got some aging parents, these classes have been a great tool to help navigate what's next. Preparing for Retirement is an online-only Zoom seminar from 7 to 8 p.m. on July 26th. Head to the church's website to register for it today. Well, I want to thank each of you who give generously as we meet the physical and spiritual needs of our community, both here at the church and for our online congregation. If you're in a position to give, please visit crv.gives. Let's continue to worship together before we hear from Pastor Jay.
We've seen what you can do, oh God of wonder. Power has no end. The things you've done before, in greater measure, you will do again. So there's no prison wall you can't break through. Mountain you can move, all things are possible. There's no broken body you can raise, no soul that you can't save. All things are possible. In the darkest night, you can light it up. You can light it up. Overcome, you've already won, oh God of revival. You rose in victory, and now you're seated forever on the throne. So why should my heart fear what you've defeated? I will trust in you alone, 'cause there's no prison wall you can't break through, no mountain you can't chains hit the ground. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Hey! Come awaken your people, come awaken this city. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble. I hear the chains hit the ground. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. In the darkest night, you can light up, you can light up. Oh, God of revival, let hope arise. Death is overcome, you've already won. Oh, God of revival. Come awaken your people, come awaken this city. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble. I hear the chains hit the ground. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Come awaken us, God of revival. Every stronghold will crumble. I hear the chains hit the ground. God of revival, pour it out.
Yeah. Man, so good to be with you guys. I have heard about these famous CRB welcomes, and to now be the recipient of one, it's better than the rumors. So thank you guys. Seriously, I'm thrilled and honored to be here. Your pastor, Jared, I met him a few months ago at this event that we were at together, and we've quickly become friends, and there's just been sort of a resonance, like we're cut from the same cloth. And so he's a man that I have deep admiration and respect and love for. And so you all are in great hands. And as an extension of him, you just need to know, as I've watched from afar, I just want to say to you, not like as a pastor or a church leader, I just want to say to you personally, as a follower, as a fellow Christian, follower of Jesus, I just want to say thank you for the way in which CRB shines light into dark places here in San Diego County and beyond. Seriously. That's not just something I'm saying. You know, I know Sam Acho was here last week, and he was talking about how he landed and came off his flight to speak here last Sunday, and he mentioned to somebody that he was speaking here, and they were like, "Oh, the Good Neighbor Church." And man, what a gift that is. Seriously, you guys, that's sadly rare in churches today. And so you are a shining example of what it means to embody the love of God in real ways. And my hope and my prayer is that more and more churches and followers of Jesus will follow your lead and live that way. So well done. I'm honored and thrilled to be with you. And honestly, aside from all of that, I just have to make an honest admission. When Pastor Jared asked me to come down and asked me to speak, I was obviously honored and thrilled and excited, but also San Diego and San Diego County is like Jenny and I, my wife and I, it's one of our favorite places on the planet. So I was like, hey, my friend Jared asked me to come down and speak. Why don't we just tag on a week-long vacation afterwards? So I'm thrilled for that too. I drove down yesterday, and then my wife, Jenny, and our 2 young kids, we have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, they're going to fly down this afternoon, and then we're just spending the next several days lounging on your beaches. And here's what you need to know. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, so I'm sure many of you have visited. 2 people love the Bay Area. Well done. Well, let's connect afterwards. And here's the thing. You guys are spoiled down here in Southern California. You think that ocean water is warm. You think that that's how it works. It does not work that way in most other parts of the world, certainly not where I live. And so we brought our kids down here several times, and they're just like, their minds are blown every time we take them to the beaches here in San Diego, because they step into the water and it's like not frigid, as it is where we live. And so that's what we're going to do. And I actually, I want to show you a picture. This is one of like dozens and dozens of pictures I have of my daughter, Harper, who is 6, and she does this every time I take her to the water. We hold hands, we walk up, we toe the water, and then immediately, once we're up against the water, she'll look up at me with a giant smile across her face and her eyes twinkling at me, essentially asking me, Daddy, is it okay if I go? And so I let her go, and she just makes a beeline for the water. This is her every time. This will be her tomorrow, I guarantee it. Now, here's what's really interesting. My daughter doesn't know how to swim. We just put her in swim lessons this summer, but she doesn't know how to swim. And she knows she doesn't know how to swim. And she's 6 now. She just turned 6. So she also knows that the ocean is actually a very big, deep, and sometimes treacherous and dangerous place. And yet, when I take her, holding my hand, she looks up at me with no fear, all confidence, and she just runs head first. Why? Because she knows that though the ocean is a big, deep, dangerous, treacherous place, she knows who she's with. Dad is here. Daddy's got me. He's not going to let anything too harmful happen to me. So she's overwhelmed with confidence. And I love that photo of her I showed you, because often it reminds me of what my journey of faith has been like. My guess is that many of us here will resonate. And when we first began following Jesus, though the waters and the oceans, the impossible seas of life before us, are big and deep and often dangerous and treacherous, we have this sense of confidence, not because of what is in front of us, but because we know who is with us. So when we know that Jesus is with us and for us, as we begin the life of faith, it feels like no matter how big, how deep, how dangerous, how treacherous, how impossible the seas of life before us may be, we run in head first, full of confidence and joy. Again, not because of what is before us, but because of who is with us. And yet, we lose this sort of confidence, do we not? Why do we lose it? We lose it because life is not easy. We lose it because life is hard, because life brings grief and pain and loss and unexpected hardship and toil and tragedy. the waves of life continue to crash in, wave after wave after wave. And though we once started with utter joy and confidence, we eventually grow exhausted. Before we know it, we begin to doubt, we begin to wonder, we begin to question, is Jesus really with me? Because life seems really hard, and sometimes life feels really lonely. We begin to be overwhelmed by fear. And I think you and I, especially after the past year, year and a half, but long before that as well, we live in many ways in a culture of fear. We live in a culture of anxiety, a culture that tells us the future is unknown and you should be worried. And for 5 easy payments of $19.99, I can take your worry away. That's the culture we live in, where culture is trying to sell us a solution to the problem of uncertainty, anxiety, fear, all of the unknown, the ocean of life before us. And so the question as we continue this series, Raise Your Voice, the question I want to explore today is how can we recapture and raise a voice of courage in a culture of fear? How can we recapture and raise a voice of courage in a culture of fear, and in the midst of the fear, the very, very personal and difficult and specific fears of our own lives? How can we raise a voice of courage? There's a story in the book of Matthew, the gospel, Good News according to Matthew, in chapter 14, where Jesus brings immense hope and confrontation to fear and to doubt. Before we get into the text, I have to paint sort of the backdrop, the backstory of what is happening in the life of Jesus and his disciples before the text we are about to read. Earlier in Matthew chapter 14, what we discover is that Jesus' cousin, a man named John the Baptist, has been executed. He's been unjustly executed. And so Jesus and his disciples obviously grieve. They are overwhelmed with pain and loss, and they are grieving. And so they journey off into solitude in order to grieve. But as they journey off, the crowds descend upon them. And the story tells us that Jesus, instead of telling the crowds to go home, that he needs some space to grieve, instead, the story tells us that Jesus has compassion on the crowds. He begins to teach them and to heal them. He eventually feeds thousands of them miraculously. And so in the midst of his own pain, his own loss, and his own grief, Jesus feels compassion for others, and he gives out of his grief and his pain and his loss, and he gives to others. He gives to thousands of people by teaching, healing, and feeding. And so you can imagine at the end of that story, they were already grieving. They were already experiencing pain and loss. And then they give, they teach, they heal, they feed, and then Jesus dismisses the crowds. You can imagine how exponentially more exhausted Jesus and his disciples were. And then the story tells us this. Matthew 14, 22 to 26. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. Jesus sends the disciples, his exhausted friends, in a boat to cross a lake so that he, in his own exhaustion, might climb a mountainside in solitude and pray. This lake that they cross is called the Sea of Galilee. Here's a photo of what it looks like today. They call it the Sea of Galilee because although technically it is a lake, it is very large. 8 miles wide, 13 miles long. So the Sea of Galilee, because of the terrain, to this day actually, there are lots of choppy waters and storms on the Sea of Galilee. And so when the disciples get into the boat, they cross across the Sea of Galilee, and it tells us that the wind comes up against the boat, and the waves begin buffeting the boat. There's a storm. Here's the thing. Jesus and his disciples are Jewish. The Jewish people are not a seafaring people. And in fact, in the Jewish mind, open waters represent chaos and disorder and danger. And so it makes sense to us why the disciples were so afraid. We can imagine that out in the middle of this giant lake, in the middle of the night, mind you, in complete darkness, they find themselves in the midst of a storm. They are already exhausted and in pain, grieving the loss of a friend. And in the midst of their fear, Jesus goes to them. Matthew 14:27, it says that Jesus walks on the water out to the lake, and then he said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. That middle line, those three little words, it is I, we translate it into those words in the English, it is I. Jesus walks out and he says, "Hey, take courage. It's me," right? We read "it is I" as in Jesus saying, "You guys, don't worry, I'm not a ghost. It's me, Jesus, your friend, your rabbi." That's how we read it, like a casual, like, it's me, right? In the original language of the text, Koine Greek, that phrase, those three words, "it is I," is actually just two Greek words, the words ego, eimi. And the Greek words ego, eimi literally translate, "I am." Jesus does not say, "Hey, take courage, it's me, Jesus, don't be afraid." What Jesus says is, "Take courage, I am, don't be afraid." Why does this matter? Those of you who are somewhat familiar with the biblical story, you know the story way back, the ancient story of Moses and God calling this ancient man Moses to go and free his people in Egypt and lead them across the wilderness into the promised land. You know this story, yes? Some of you, most of you? You've seen the Prince of Egypt movie from the late 90s? Okay, that story, okay? At the beginning of that story, when God asks Moses to go and free his people, the way he does it is he calls Moses by a burning bush, calls him up to a mountainside. And then this happens. Exodus 3. Moses said to God, "Okay, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" Moses is insecure. He's afraid. He doesn't want to go. And he says, "God, you're sending me to free your people, but what if they ask me your name? Who do I tell them sent me?" And then God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. I am." From this moment on, for the Jewish people, the words "I am" emphatically represented the divine name of God. This is why Matthew places this story of Jesus walking on the water in the middle of his story. If you look at your Bibles, you will find that the Gospel of Matthew has 28 chapters, yes? Where is this story? It's in the middle of chapter 14. In fact, if you read the Gospel of Matthew in the original language, in the Greek, within less than 100 words, amongst tens of thousands of words, less than 100 words separates the literal exact middle of Matthew's Gospel from these two Greek words, ego, eimi. I am. Most scholars believe that Matthew places those two words, I am, right in the middle of his story to shine with big, bright, blinking lights the explanation and revelation and revealing of who Jesus actually is. That in the midst of all of the storms and anxieties, uncertainties, and fears of our life, in the midst of the storms and the waves that buffet against the boat of your human experience, Jesus walks on the water and he declares definitively, he's not just a significant historical figure, he's not just a good moral teacher. Jesus is the great I am. God himself. What does this mean? What does this mean for us? It means that when you look out on the ocean of your life, all the impossibility, all the anxiety, all that is uncertain before you, Jesus does not swim in that ocean, he walks above that ocean. And he declares to you and to me, take courage. I am. Don't be afraid. But what happens in the story? Doubt continues to creep in for the disciples. In fact, 11 of the disciples make the decision that they're not sure that that's really Jesus. They find it safer inside the boat than out on the water with Jesus. And then there's one man. His name is Peter. And he says this, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. And Jesus says, come. Then Peter got down out of the boat and he walked on the water and he came toward Jesus. But when he, Peter, saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? When they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. And then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Peter says to Jesus, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. Which is weird, right? Because if it was like a villain, what do you think he's going to tell you? He's going to be like, yeah, it's me, Jesus, just come. You know, like Peter's like so naively trusting. If it's you, tell me to come out there into the danger, right? It's like so strange. But it is Jesus. And Jesus says, come. And so Peter, for a moment, steps out of the boat, puts his feet down on the water, and finds that he is okay. And then it says that Peter's gaze leaves Jesus and he sees the wind. And he begins to sink. Why did Peter doubt? I mean, despite all that he had seen Jesus do, literally just hours earlier, feeding thousands miraculously, healing, not just today, but many times over the course of their life together. Why did Peter doubt? Why do we doubt? Despite all that we have seen Jesus do in this church and in our own lives, despite all that we have seen Jesus do in the lives of those around us, despite all that we have seen Jesus do through his church, throughout history, why is it that we still doubt like Peter doubted? Why? Because we see the wind. Because rather than keeping our gaze fixed on Christ, we begin to look at the dangerous circumstances surrounding us. We begin to see the impossible seas before us, the dangerous, treacherous oceans that we feel like we will never be able to cross. We doubt because we have experienced the storms of life and they have left us tired and weary and exhausted. But I want you to notice in the story, Jesus does not reprimand Peter for his doubt and then saves him. What does the story say? Peter begins to sink, and then in verse 31, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. And then Jesus says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? When Peter doubts, Jesus rescues him first before addressing the doubt. Your doubt does not keep Jesus from rescuing you. Your fear, your anxiety, your pain, your grief, those things and so much more, they do not keep Jesus from rescuing you. Jesus doesn't rescue you after doubt. Jesus rescues you in and in the midst of your doubt. Jesus does not rescue us after the fear and after the anxiety. Jesus reaches out his hand and he pulls us up from the fear, from the anxiety, from the uncertainty. Listen, maybe you're doubting today. Maybe life is hard. Maybe that diagnosis was not the one you expected nor the one you wanted. Maybe that relationship didn't work out the way that you thought it would. Maybe financial situations or family situations or deep, dark inner turmoils that no one else knows about is just eating away at you and you find yourself doubting. Maybe you feel hopeless and lost and faithless. Your rescue is not dependent upon the strength nor the fragility of your faith. Your rescue is dependent on the strength of he who rescues you. Tim Keller puts it this way: it is not the strength of your faith, but the object of your faith that actually saves you. The what in front of you does not dictate whether or not you will be rescued. It is the who that really matters. The late, great Eugene Peterson puts it this way. He describes the dance between faith and doubt as a trapeze artist who lets go of one bar and hangs in midair, waiting to grab hold of the next bar. That's doubt and faith. And Peterson says that it is a moment of expectation, uncertainty, and extraordinary aliveness. Doubt does not kill you. It actually has the power to bring you to life if you would reach out your hand and allow Jesus to lift you up. I told you earlier that Matthew places these two incredible words, I am, right smack dab in the center of his story of Jesus. And that he does so as a wink and a nod to the Exodus story. What's really interesting is that most scholars agree that Matthew, throughout his gospel story, is trying to make very direct allusions to Moses and the Exodus story. Many scholars describe Matthew as propping Jesus up as a sort of new Moses, but not like a Moses 2.0. No, instead, using the story of Moses, as Moses led the Israelites out of literal slavery in a land called Egypt through a literal wilderness into a literal promised land, that now Jesus has come to do the work that not even Moses could do, to lead us out of slavery and bondage to sin and to death, to guide us through the many wildernesses of our lives, and to lead us into the promise, not of just a physical land, but the promise of eternal hope and joy with him forever. That in many ways, all of the Gospel of Matthew is a sort of reimagining of the Exodus story. And as such, whenever you have water imagery in the Exodus story, what scholars will tell you is that Matthew is making parallels to the central water story of Exodus, which you all know. It's the story of the Israelites right after they have left Egypt. Pharaoh has released them into freedom. And then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, an evil man, changes his mind, and he decides that he and his armies are going to come roaring back to recapture the people and enslave them again. And the Israelites find themselves between a literal rock and a hard place. Behind them is Pharaoh and the Egyptian army coming to capture them. And before them is a big, dangerous, deep, treacherous ocean called the Red Sea. There is no way back and there is no way forward. They are absolutely stuck. What happens in that story? You know. God does the unthinkable, the impossible. He parts the sea. He parts the sea so that the people can cross to safety on dry land. You know, often when I take my daughter to the ocean, as I will tomorrow, sometimes I'll have this thing happen in my mind. I will wonder to myself, what if I were an Israelite dad with a young child on that day? What would I have thought? What would I have done if I knew that the Egyptian army was behind us coming to enslave us and before us was a sea, an ocean that we could not cross? What would I have done? You know what I always come to? I would have put my daughter on my back and I would have jumped into that water and I would just swim as far and as hard as I could. Not because I thought I could actually cross the ocean, but I couldn't. As a loving father, I couldn't stand there and do nothing. And so I would put my little girl on my back and go swim as hard and as fast and as long as I could to keep her alive and safe. But here's what I also know. I'm a limited human being. And at some point, we would drown. But it would matter to me as her father to let her know that I love her too much to do nothing. Here's the craziest thing about the Exodus story. God feels the same way about you. When you are before an impossible sea, in his abundant, unending goodness, he will strap you to his back and he will cross that sea for as long and as hard and as fast as he possibly can. But here is the difference. God is utterly able. You see, God doesn't need to swim. God parts impossible oceans. Jesus doesn't need to swim. He doesn't come to the disciples in the water. He walks above the water. You know, that phrase, take courage, I am, no fear. I told you that those words, it is I, were two Greek words, I am. What's really fascinating is that last phrase, don't be afraid. Those three words are actually in the original language also just two words, and it's an incomplete sentence. They are two words in the Greek that simply mean no fear. Right smack dab in the middle of Matthew's gospel, you know what happens? The disciples are in a storm. They're afraid. They're doubting. They're anxious. Their future is uncertain. And the great I am, the God of the universe, walks to them above the storm. And he says to them, take courage. I am, no fear. If you are afraid today, if you are anxious today, if you are uncertain today, if you are doubting today, if you are in pain or experiencing loss or grief, if you feel fragile and frail and weak, and the storms of life are buffeting up against you, know this: in the midst of your fear, in the midst of your doubt, in the midst of your anxiety, the great I am walks to you now, and he says, take courage, I am, no fear. Take courage, I am, no fear. Take courage, I am, no fear. Let's pray together. Jesus, we stand before you and we admit to you our fears, our doubts, our anxieties, our uncertainties. And we thank you that you reach out your hand to pull us up in spite of the doubt, in spite of the uncertainty, in spite of the anxiety, in spite of the fear. So we take to heart those words you speak over us now, just as you spoke them to those disciples in the middle of that stormy lake, to take courage in you, to know that you are the great I am, and that with you and in you there is no fear. Help us to live as a fearless people in the confidence we have in your abundant, unending goodness. And we pray these things, Jesus, in your name. Amen.
I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never failed me. And all my days I've been held in your hand. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am in, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire in darkest nights. You are close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. And I have lived in the goodness of God. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God.
Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me always. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down and surrendered now, I give you everything.
Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Oh, I'm gonna sing of your goodness, Lord.
For more than 25 years, the Church at RB has supported people around the world in our mission to change lives through God's love. Here in San Diego, we've served as hands of hope for our homeless, walked alongside victims of human trafficking, and helped break the cycle of poverty for vulnerable children. This is what we do. We show up for the neighborhood. In 2020, the needs of our city multiplied. We discovered more and more children are at risk.
Unfortunately, there are thousands of kids under the age of 17 who are at our border, who've been escaping their home countries, mostly in Central America, from violence, who've been orphaned, they're in danger, and they're trying to find safety here in the United States. It really became an issue that these kids were not being in safe, healthy conditions. So they reached out to San Diego and said, would you be able to take some of these youth to provide a safe environment, a safe place for them to stay until we were able to move them to the next place.
With SD Youth Services' 50-year reputation of serving homeless and foster youth in San Diego, the city reached out to Walter and his team to care for these at-risk children.
My name is Hannah. I'm 16. I've been going to church since I was in 3rd grade, so about 8 years.
So tell me a little bit about when you first heard about the convention center and what was going on there.
I was riding my bike down the same path and I looked over at the convention center and I knew that they had been doing homeless care there, but I was just curious of how they were using it since they can't do any events. I did a quick Google search later that night and I found out that the next day they were bringing in 500 migrant girls from a border detention facility in Texas, and that the center was going to be used to house them. I had no idea that it was happening, and it made me want to learn more and do something to help.
Hannah took action. First, she made direct contact with SD Youth Services, asking what they needed to better serve these girls. Next, Hannah reached out to us, and we jumped on her call to help. Just a couple weeks later, Hannah led a team at one of our Good Neighbor Days, packing 1,000 much-needed care kits as well as notes of encouragement to show that these children are indeed loved.
It's just always kind of been in my family, like when we see a problem, like you try to do what you can to solve it.
Your care kits were just a lifesaver for them. Basic things that we take for granted that children should have that they didn't have. So it was such an incredible gift that you and the church gave to us.
It's through partners like SD Youth Services and hearts like Hannah that allow this church to make our city and this community new.
When we work together, our impact is amplified.